All right, everyone. Let's get started. So, hello, and welcome to the Seattle Atheist Church. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, whatever you like to call yourselves, you are welcome here. At the Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. The Seattle Atheist Church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to other conscious beings. We believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds good to you, then you're in the right place. Before we get on with today's talk, there's a few announcements. Every second Sunday, we have board games after church at the Wayward Coffee House in Ravenna, is it? Yes. And every third Saturday of the month, we have a secular social at Browers in Fremont. And everyone's invited, but of course it's 21 and over on. So I'd like to remind everyone to please take a moment to RSVP before you come to the talks. That's mostly to let everyone else know that folks are actually coming here. So it's a lot easier to be the 26th person who shows up after you see that there's 25 people RSVP'd than it is to be the 4th person if you see only 3. So there's way more people here than I think RSVP'd today, which is awesome. But there's a whole bunch more folks who just look at the events and wonder, like, oh, how big is this group? Am I going to feel uncomfortable? So just RSVP if you could. Finally, if you find these talks valuable and you enjoy the group discussion afterwards, as I do, then please consider donating to support us. Your donations allow us to rent the room, provide refreshments, and continue to foster the community that we've grown here. It takes 23 people donating $5 each week for us to break even, and any shortage of it is covered out of pocket by Troy and I and the Walters. Of course, we love to do better than break even, so we can start building up a surplus that would let us have a presence at community events throughout the year, like the Pride Parade and various street fairs. If you'd like to make a donation in person here today, we accept cash in the jar on the back, and Troy has a PayPal card reader if you'd like to donate using credit. We also have a donate button on our website at seattleatheist.church, where you can set up a monthly recurring donation if you prefer to just set it and forget it. Another way you can contribute is to invite your friends and family. If you know someone who you think would enjoy what we do here, invite them along. If there's someone from church you haven't seen in a while, reach out to them and catch up. Our group discussion gets even more valuable as we hear from more diverse perspectives. Okay, so on with today's talk.
Next week's talk?
Oh, yes, next week's talk. Next week's talk is, Eve is giving a talk on anything that's worth doing is worth doing badly. Which should be very interesting. Right, so the way we do it here at Seattle Atheist Church is every quarter we have a planning meeting. So we brainstorm ideas of what talks that we want to hear given and what talks we'd like to give. And the community gives their feedback. We vote. And so it's the members of the community ourselves that give the talks. Today, that's me. Hello. So, today I wanted to go over an article that came across my feed a while back. It's a provocative article with a provocative title. It's basically just immoral to be rich. Before I get any further, I just want to get a sense for the sentiment in the room. By a show of hands, how many of you tend to agree with the proposition it's basically just immoral to be rich, even if it doesn't fully capture all the nuance that you'd like? Okay, good number. Interesting. If you'd like to follow along with the text, feel free to pull it up on your phones. You can just search for it's basically just immoral to be rich. Don't worry about rushing. You'll have a few minutes to find it. So my gut reaction to seeing this headline was, this is just going to be some radical Marxist agitprop garbage. But as happens from time to time, I clicked on it anyway, and I have to say it drew me in. Now, personally, I really don't want to agree with the conclusion here, which the title, of course, just tosses right out in the open. but I'm having some trouble pinpointing the flaw in the reasoning. You see, I came across the concept of motivated skepticism versus motivated credulity while reading Less Wrong. Attributed to Thomas Gilovich, a professor of psychology at Cornell University, this distinction, quote, highlights how conclusions a person does not want to believe are held to a higher standard than conclusions that a person wants to believe. A motivated skeptic asks if the evidence compels them to accept the conclusion. A motivated credulist asks if the evidence allows them to accept the conclusion, end quote. This dovetails nicely with a snippet from a Less Wrong article that I gave voice to during my talk about some of the problems with moral relativism, an article called The Proper Use of Humility. Quote, the temptation is always to claim the most points with the least effort. The temptation is to carefully integrate all incoming news in a way that lets us change our beliefs, and above all, our actions, as little as possible. John Kenneth Galbraith said, faced with the choice of changing one's mind and proving that there is no need to do so, almost everyone gets busy on the proof. And the greater the inconvenience of changing one's mind, the more effort people will expend on that proof. End quote. The conclusion that it's basically just immoral to be rich would be very inconvenient indeed, and would require quite a change in actions. So we have two competing theories. One, I don't have to accept the conclusion because there's some flaw in the reasoning. And two, I don't want to accept the conclusion because, well, I don't want to accept the sacrifice, the change in actions that changing my mind would require. And so I subject it to excessive, undue scrutiny. Which is it? Well, of course, there's no way to tell before hearing or reading the reasoning in the article, but I wanted to plant that question in your brain so that you can ponder it while I talk through the article. There's a key takeaway from the class I took in the philosophy of science that may be of service here. To decide between two competing theories, which both seem to fit the available evidence, you can't just look at the evidence that both theories predict. To decide between them, you have to determine where they differ in their predictions and test it there. That's not an answer, but it provides a framework for figuring out what an answer might look like. As Richard Feynman said, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And so, people of the Seattle Atheist Church, help me not to fool myself by letting me know your thoughts during our group discussion after the talk. Like I said during my talk on the Houston Manifesto, which I adapted from one of Sam Harris's live shows, even for the parts that I think sound reasonable, I want to be wrong for the shortest possible amount of time. So if you think you have a knockdown counter-argument, or if you know of something critical that the author seems to have missed, I want to hear it. Please don't walk out of here after the discussion muttering it under your breath. Try to get your criticism or concern out during the discussion, or come talk to me afterwards. The same goes for suggestions about where it is that the two theories might differ in their predictions, as well as suggestions for how to go about testing in those spots. Okay, so before I dive into the text, I'd like to share a little background that I think explains why I resonated so strongly with this piece. By a show of hands, who here has heard of Peter Singer's drowning child argument? Okay, a few, a handful. Cool. You all shush. No spoilers. The rest of you, let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine, if you will, that you're in college, walking, as students do, to class. Imagine that your route to class takes you past a shallow pond. One morning, you notice a child has fallen in and appears to be drowning. To wade in and pull the child out would be easy, but it will mean that you get your clothes wet and muddy. And by the time you go home and change, you will have missed your first class. By a show of hands, do you have any obligation to rescue the child? Good amount. Right. So the importance of saving a child so far outweighs the cost of getting one's clothes muddy and missing a class that we should refuse to consider it any kind of excuse for not saving the child. Now imagine there are other people walking past the pond who would equally be able to rescue the child, but who are not doing so. By a show of hands, who thinks this detail is morally relevant and makes a difference concerning your obligation to save the child? A few here and there. That'll be an interesting discussion. Right, so generally the fact that others are not doing what they ought to do is no reason why I should not do what I ought to do. Okay, so now imagine the child is far away, in another country perhaps, but similarly in danger of death, and equally within your means to save, at no great cost, and at absolutely no danger to yourself. By a show of hands, who thinks this detail is morally relevant and makes a difference concerning your obligation to save the child? All right, some waviness. All right, so generally the point that Singer is trying to make here is distance and nationality make no moral difference to the situation. So that thought experiment was adapted from Peter Singer's article, The Drowning Child and the Expanding Circle, published in 1997, which is easily available online. In it, Singer points out that, quote, "We are all in that situation of the person passing the shallow pond. We can all save lives of people, both children and adults, who would otherwise die, and can do so at very small cost to us. The cost of a new CD, a shirt, or a night out at a restaurant or concert can mean the difference between life and death to more than one person somewhere in the world. And overseas aid agencies like Oxfam overcome the problem of acting at a distance. We live in a time when many people experience their lives as empty and lacking in fulfillment. The decline of religion and the collapse of communism have left but the ideology of the free market, whose only message is consume, and work hard so you can earn money to consume more. Yet even those who do reasonably well in this race for material goods do not find that they are satisfied with their way of life. We now have good scientific evidence for what philosophers have said throughout the ages. Once we have enough to satisfy our basic needs, gaining more wealth does not bring us more happiness." End quote. So once you reach the point where your basic needs are met, you're not suffering for want of anything. You've got a bit of luxury on top of that. Once you've reached the point where more money won't bring you more happiness, what's the point of having more? What good does it do you? It becomes just a number on a screen, stored in a database somewhere at your bank or brokerage, a kind of victory points in this game of life. All right, so you've had just a taste of the background that made me resonate with this article. For more, I very much recommend Peter Singer's monumentally influential work, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, published in 1972. So without further pre-rambling, it's basically just immoral to be rich. A reminder that people who possess great wealth in a time of poverty are directly causing that poverty. This was first published in June 14th, 2017. Here is a simple statement of principle that doesn't get repeated enough. If you possess billions of dollars in a world where many people struggle because they do not have much money, you are an immoral person. The same is true if you possess hundreds of millions of dollars, or even millions of dollars. Being extremely wealthy is impossible to justify in a world containing deprivation. Even though there is a lot of public discussion about inequality, there seems to be far less talk about just how patently shameful it is to be rich. After all, there are plenty of people on this earth who die, or who watch their loved ones die, because they cannot afford to pay for medical care. There are elderly people who become homeless because they cannot afford rent. There are children living on streets and in cars. There are mothers who can't afford diapers for their babies. All of this is beyond dispute. And all of it could be ameliorated if people who had lots of money simply gave it to those other people. It is, therefore, deeply shameful to be rich. It is not a morally defensible thing to be. To take a US example, white families in America have 16 times as much wealth on average as black families. This is indisputably because of slavery, which was very recent. For perspective, there are people alive today who met people who were once slaves. Larry Ellison of Oracle could put his $55 billion in a fund that could be used to just give houses to black families. not quite as direct reparations, but simply as a means of addressing the fact that the average white family has a house while the average black family does not. But instead of doing this, Larry Ellison bought the island of Lanai. It's kind of extraordinary that a single human being can just own the 6th largest island in Hawaii. But that's what concentrated wealth leads to. Because every dollar you have is a dollar you're not giving to someone else. The decision to retain wealth is a decision to deprive others. Note that this is a slightly different point than the usual ones made about rich people. For example, it is sometimes claimed that CEOs get paid too much, or that the super wealthy do not pay enough in taxes. My claim has nothing to do with either of these debates. You can hold my position and simultaneously believe that CEOs should get paid however much a company decides to pay them, and that taxes are, in fact, a tyrannical form of legalized theft. What I'm arguing about is not the question of how much people should be given, but the morality of their retaining it after it is given to them. Many times, defenses of the accumulation of great wealth depend on justifications for the initial acquisition of that wealth. The libertarian-ish philosopher Robert Nozick gave a well-known hypothetical that is used to challenge claims that wealthy people did not deserve their wealth. Suppose millions of people enjoy watching Wilt Chamberlain play basketball. And suppose, Nozick wrote, that each of these people would happily give Wilt Chamberlain 25 cents for the privilege of watching him play basketball. And suppose that through the process of people paying Wilt Chamberlain, he ended up with millions of dollars, each of which, while each of his audience members had willingly sacrificed a quarter. Even though Wilt Chamberlain is now far richer than anyone else in society, would anyone say that his acquisition of wealth was unjust? Libertarians use this example to rebut attempts to say that the rich do not deserve their wealth. After all, they say, the process by which those rich people attain their wealth is totally consensual. We'd have to be crazy Stalinists to believe that I shouldn't have the right to pay you a quarter to watch you play basketball. Why, look at Mark Zuckerberg. Nobody has to use Facebook. He's rich because people like the product he came up with. Clearly, his wealth is the product of his own labor, and nobody should deprive him of it. People on the right often defend wealth along these lines. I earned it, therefore it's not unfair for me to have it. But there is a separate question that this defense ignores. Regardless of whether you have earned it, to what degree are you morally permitted to retain it? The question of getting and the question of keeping are distinct. As a parallel, if I came into the possession of an EpiPen and I encounter a child experiencing a severe allergic reaction, the question of whether I am obligated to inject the child is distinguishable from the question of whether I obtained the pen legitimately. It's important to be clear about these distinctions because we might answer questions about systems differently than we answer questions about individual behavior. For example, the sentiment, I don't hate capitalism, I just hate rich people, is a perfectly legitimate and consistent perspective. I therefore think that there is a sort of deflection that goes on with defenses of wealth. If we find it appalling that there are so many rich people in a time of need, we are asked to consider questions of acquisition rather than questions of retention. The retention question, after all, is much harder for a wealthy person to answer. It's one thing to argue that you got rich legitimately. It's another to explain why you feel justified in spending your wealth upon houses and sculptures, rather than helping some struggling people pay their rent, or paying off a bunch of student loans, or saving thousands of people from dying of malaria. There may be nothing unseemly about the process by which a basketball player earns his millions. We can debate this. But there's certainly something unseemly about having those millions. One of the reasons wealthy people rarely have to defend their choices is that shaming the rich is not really compatible with any of the predominating political perspectives. People on the right obviously believe that having piles of wealth is fine. Centrist Democrats can't attack rich people for being rich because they're increasingly a party for rich people. And socialists, this is an interesting case, tend to believe that questions about the morality of having wealth are relatively unimportant because they're far more interested in how the state divides up wealth than in what individuals choose to do with it. As G.A. Cohen points out in his 2001 book, If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich?, Marxists have been concerned with eliminating capitalism generally, which has kept them from thinking about questions of the justice of people's personal choices. After all, if the problem of inequality is systemic, and rich people do not really make choices but pursue their class interests, then asking whether it is moral for wealthy people to retain their wealth is both irrelevant, because individual decisions don't affect the systemic problem, and incoherent, because the idea of moral or immoral capitalist makes no sense in the Marxist framework. In fact, there's a certain leftist argument that giving away wealth in the form of charity is actually bad, because it allows capitalism to look superficially generous without actually altering the balance of power in society. As Oscar Wilde ludicrously put it, the worst slave owners are those who were kind to their slaves, because they prevented the core of the system from being realized by those who suffered from it. In their book, Blueprints for Sparkling Tomorrow, Nimney and Robinson parody this perspective by portraying two leftist academics who insist on being rude to servers in restaurants, on the grounds that being polite to them obscures the true brutality of class relations. But I think it is a mistake to avoid inquiring into the moral justifications for wealth. This is because I think individual decisions do matter, because if I am an extremely wealthy man, I could be helping a lot of people who I am choosing not to help. And for those people, at least, it makes a difference when a billionaire decides to retain their wealth rather than rid themselves of it. Of course, when you start talking about whether it's moral to be rich, you end up heading down some difficult logical paths. If I'm obligated to use my wealth to help people, am I not obligated to keep doing this until I am myself a pauper? Surely this obligation attaches to anyone who consumes luxuries that they do not need, or has some savings that they're not spending on malaria treatment for children. But the central point I want to make here is that the moral duty becomes greater the more wealth you have. If you end up with a $50,000 a year or $100,000 a year salary, we can debate what amount you should spend on helping other people. But if you earn $250,000 a year or $1 million a year, it's quite clear that the bulk of your income should be given away. You can live very comfortably on $100,000 or so, and have luxury and indulgence. So anything beyond that is almost indisputably indefensible. And the super rich, the infamous millionaires and billionaires, are constantly squandering resources that could be used to create wonderful and humane things. If you're a billionaire, you could literally open a hospital and make it free. You could buy up a bunch of abandoned Baltimore row houses, do them up, and give them to families. You could help make sure no child ever had to go without lunch. We can define something like a maximum moral income, beyond which it's obviously inexcusable not to give away all of the rest. It might be $50,000. Call it $100,000 though, per person, with an additional $50,000 allowed per child. This means two parents with a child can still earn $250,000 a year. That's so much money. And you can keep it. But everyone who earns anything beyond it is obligated to give the excess away in its entirety. The refusal to do so means intentionally allowing others to suffer, a statement that is true regardless of whether you earned or deserved the income you were originally given. The author of the article says that, personally, they think the maximum moral income is probably much lower. Let's just set it here so that everyone can agree on it. They do tend to think that the moral requirement should be attainable in practice, and a $30K threshold would actually require people experience some deprivation, whereas a $100K threshold indisputably still leaves you with an incredibly comfortable lifestyle, better than almost any other had by anyone in history. Of course, wealthy people do give away money, but so often in piecemeal and self-interested and foolish ways. They'll donate to colleges with huge endowments to get needless buildings built and named after them. David Geffen will pay to open a school for the children of wealthy university faculty and somehow be praised for it. Mark Zuckerberg will squander millions of dollars trying to fix Newark schools by hiring $1,000 a day consultants. Brad Pitt will try to build homes for Katrina victims in New Orleans, but will insist they're architecturally cutting edge and funky looking, instead of just trying to make as many simple houses as possible. Just as the rich can't be trusted to spend their money well, generally, they're colossally terrible at giving it away. This is because so much is about self-aggrandizement, and philanthropy is far more about the donor than the donee. Furthermore, if you're a multi-billionaire, giving away $1 billion is morally meaningless. If you've got $3 billion and you give away $1, you're still incredibly wealthy, and thus still harming many people through your retention of wealth. You have to get rid of all of it, beyond the maximum moral income. The central point, however, is this. It is not justifiable to retain vast wealth. This is because that wealth has the potential to help people who are suffering, and by not helping them, you are letting them suffer. It does not make a difference whether you earned the vast wealth. The point is that you have it. And whether or not we should raise the tax rates, or cap CEO pay, or rearrange the economic system, we should all be able to acknowledge, before we discuss anything else, that it is immoral to be rich. That much is clear. Okay, there's a lot to talk about there, but before we circle up for our group discussion, I'd like to get an update on the sentiment in the room. Now, by a show of hands, how many of you would tend to agree with the proposition, it's basically just immoral to be rich, even if it doesn't fully capture the nuance that you'd like? All right. Interesting. Okay, so as a reminder, please bring to light any flaws you see with the argument as presented, and please let me know your thoughts on how we can tell whether we're rejecting the conclusion or subjecting it to excessive undue scrutiny just because we don't like it. Oh, and one more thing. If you're feeling like you want to donate some of your hard-earned money, but don't know what to donate to or where to start, please check out givewell.org. GiveWell is a nonprofit dedicated to finding outstanding giving opportunities through in-depth analysis. Thousands of hours of research have gone into finding their top-rated charities. They're evidence-backed, thoroughly vetted, and underfunded. Just check out their top charities and donate to one or more of those. If you're too busy to look into the details but still want to make a big difference, just donate to the Against Malaria Foundation and get some more life-saving anti-mosquito bed nets distributed. Okay, let's discuss.